Then on Sports Central, I'll be giving you guys my Big Noon Kickoff location predictions for the 2022 season. And as we continue to rapidly approach this upcoming college football season, today we'll be going in depth into some of the big matchups coming up here in 2022 and predicting where the Big Noon Kickoff crew is going to be in each week of this upcoming college football season. So that said, let's go and look at week 0, which is going to be Nebraska and Northwestern in Dublin, Ireland. Pretty big matchup for both these teams here, especially for Nebraska. You got the Cornhuskers here coming into the season. Scott Frost is absolutely on the hot seat coming into the season. If he doesn't get 6 or 7 wins here in 2022, there's almost a guarantee that he's going to be fired. So it's a huge game for Nebraska to get back on the right track, especially after a brutal 2021 season. I mean, both Nebraska and Northwestern were 3-9 last season, but Nebraska was a much better 3-9 team than Northwestern was. I mean, people are saying that Nebraska's 2021 team was the best 3-9 team of all time. And that's saying a lot about a Husker team that hasn't been to a bowl game since 2016. So it's obviously a huge game for Nebraska to get back on the right track. And they're facing off against Northwestern, a team that's in a rebuild phase right now, trying to get back to where they were a couple of seasons ago as they won the Big Ten West. But they were arguably the worst team in the Big Ten last season at 3-9, and they definitely did not look good for a good chunk of the season. So big match for both these teams here in week 0, and it's in Dublin, Ireland, and it's not for sure as to whether Big Noon Kickoff is going to have a crew there in Dublin to have a pregame show, but I can almost guarantee there's going to be a pregame show of some sort for the biggest game of week 0 here in Nebraska and Northwestern. So we'll see what happens there. But for week 0, yep, this is the matchup for it. Moving on to week 1, though, we got Penn State and Purdue. This game has been confirmed. It is on a Thursday night, September 1st in West Lafayette. A pretty big matchup coming up here in week 1. You got two teams, Penn State and Purdue. Both teams are expected to at least be good this season. Of course, you got Penn State, who's probably expected 8 to 10 wins, and Purdue kind of in the same area. I mean, Purdue, of course, coming off of a great 2021 season. Purdue was 9-4 last year, so it was a really good season for them, for their standards, and they are definitely on the rise right now going into 2022. So it's a huge match for both these teams for a week 1 matchup. I mean, it's a huge conference game. I mean, you got Purdue, who's obviously got as high of expectations in an offseason as we've seen in quite a while. I mean, Purdue usually is, I mean, if they can get to a bowl game, that's a good thing, but Purdue could go far and beyond that. They've got a chance to win the Big Ten West this season, so obviously the stakes are high for them, and so yeah, huge match for both these teams, and it has been confirmed once again for a Thursday night, September 1st. For week 2, we've got Alabama and Texas, and this game has also been confirmed by Fox. And I do want to mention as well, before we get too far into this, some of you guys may wonder what is the difference between College Game Day and Big Noon Kickoff. Both are pregame shows for college football. College Game Day has been around longer than Big Noon Kickoff has. But of course, Big Noon Kickoff is basically the Fox version of College Game Day, which is a show obviously on ESPN. So, and the thing is about Big Noon Kickoff is it usually only includes teams from the Big Ten for the most part. The Big Ten is the primary conference, or the Big 12 in some occasions. Of course, when you got your non-conference matchups, it does make a difference. In this situation, of course, you got Alabama, who's an SEC team, but of course, Texas is in the Big 12, so there are some ties there for Texas to be on a big noon game here on Fox. And so we got Alabama and Texas for this matchup in Austin. And yeah, this game has been confirmed. It is on Fox, which is one of those rare occasions where you see an SEC team on Fox. And once again, another thing is you're never going to see an SEC team as the home team for a Big Noon Kickoff game, once again, because Big Noon Kickoff only goes to the games that have ties with Fox, being once again the Big 10 primarily, and then also the Big 12. The Pac-12 also has ties with Fox, but you're not going to see them in the 11 a.m. Central noon window. So that's why the Pac-12 usually isn't involved in Big Noon Kickoff. But for this situation, once again, we got Alabama and Texas in week 2. Huge match for both these teams. Both teams have tremendous potential going into 2022. Week 3 is going to be Oklahoma and Nebraska. This one has also been confirmed. There are 4 matchups that have been confirmed. Weeks 1 through 3 potentially 0, and of course your Week 13 matchup as well, which we'll get to. But Oklahoma, Nebraska in Lincoln, huge match for both these teams, huge rivalry matchup from the past. You got Nebraska once again, who's obviously got a huge season ahead of them, especially for the future of Scott Frost. And they got Oklahoma at home in this matchup. Of course, OU has had several big, significant changes going into 2022 with coaching, with the quarterback situation. Everything is different for OU. So definitely a very intriguing matchup coming up here in Week 3 on September 17th. Moving on to Week 4, we've got Maryland and Michigan in Ann Arbor. And this is a Big Ten conference matchup. Definitely, I mean, you could say this matchup isn't going to be a very good one, and that Michigan just destroys Maryland in this matchup, which is a possibility. But I will say Fox's main tie is with the Big Ten, so it totally makes sense if they want to have a Michigan game or be in Ann Arbor at some point early in the season. So it makes sense if they go to Maryland at Michigan for this matchup. Plus, I mean, you never know. Maryland could be a decent team next year, and they could make it competitive. So I've got Maryland and Michigan for Week 4. It could be Minnesota and Michigan State as well. Potentially they want to go to East Lansing, but that's a matchup not in the same division. And plus, I think Michigan, it's more intriguing to go to Ann Arbor, considering they're the defending champions of the Big Ten. Once again, Fox's main tie is with the Big Ten. They could also go to Baylor and Iowa State, but both teams I don't really expect to be terribly good next season. I think Baylor disappoints a bit, and Iowa State is kind of in a rebuild year. So I do think, once again, Maryland and Michigan is my top pick for Week 4. Moving on to Week 5, we've got Michigan and Iowa in Iowa City. And this is a pretty big matchup here. It is out of division, so you got Iowa from the West, Michigan from the East. But either way, both teams, it's a rematch of your Big Ten title game from last season, so it makes total sense. And I will say as well, I do want to mention this as well, Fox and Big Noon Kickoff only go to games that are in the Big Noon window, meaning the only games that are on their own network. So they're not going to go to an ESPN game, for example, which means if Michigan and Iowa is on an ESPN network, which could happen, I do think that they end up going to, say, Purdue at Minnesota or Oklahoma State and Baylor if they can get one of those games. But I do have Michigan and Iowa landing on Big Noon. So that means Big Noon Kickoff is going to be here for this game, or in Iowa City for this matchup between Michigan and Iowa. Should be a pretty good one here. Both teams certainly could come into this matchup undefeated, which would make for a pretty good matchup in Week 5. Moving on to Week 6, we got Ohio State and Michigan State in East Lansing. And I think Michigan State next season, maybe not going to be quite as good as they were in 2021, but they're still going to be a good football team. Potentially 8 or 9, maybe 10 wins. And then you got Ohio State, the Buckeyes, who are clearly the favorite to win the Big Ten going into next season. I mean, Michigan isn't far behind, but Ohio State is expected to be one of the top teams in the running for the national title next year. So huge matchup in East Lansing, Michigan State at home. It's a pretty big one here between Ohio State and Michigan State. Obviously a slight rivalry as well. Should make for a good one. And I mean, Oklahoma and Texas, of course, is an option, but I do think that that game lands on an ESPN network as it did last year. So we will put that one aside. Same with K-State and Iowa State. So this could be a potential Big 12 week for Big Noon Kickoff, but I think in the end it's going to be in East Lansing for the Buckeyes and the Spartans. Moving on to Week 7, we got Penn State at Michigan. Michigan once again on Big Noon Kickoff. You're going to see that quite a bit this season, I think. Penn State, of course, being a team that, I mean, they could be undefeated going into this matchup. They do have a couple of tough games. They do have to play Auburn in one of their non-conference games, which could be a potential challenge there. But, I mean, both teams should have pretty good records going into this matchup here, I think, and should make for a good one in Ann Arbor. You also got Wisconsin and Michigan State, which could potentially end up on an ESPN network. This game could as well, but I've got this one landing on Fox in the end. Could be Nebraska and Purdue as well. You never know. Potentially Nebraska and Purdue both have got really good records heading into Week 7. I mean, Nebraska's schedule really sets up that way, and even for Purdue, they've certainly got some potential there. So it could be Nebraska and Purdue as well, but in the end, I guess it could be Penn State and Michigan, a rivalry matchup, and certainly a very intriguing one as well. Moving on to Week 8, we have got Texas and Oklahoma State in Stillwater. Pretty big matchup in the Big 12. Definitely one of the bigger ones of the season here. You got two teams that certainly could be towards the top of the Big 12 next season. Oklahoma State, of course, is a team that I do think especially has got a good chance to win the Big 12 title. And Texas, of course, they were 5-7 last year, but they've got sky-high expectations going into 2022. And that seems like a very common theme for Texas, being a team that just has got super high expectations in the offseason, but they disappoint a lot of times. But who knows? This could be their year as well, and I definitely think it's a possibility with Quinn Ewers and the amount of talent that they've got there. But this is a big matchup for Week 8. I think Fox lands this Big 12 matchup, and they put it on Big Noon. You also got Iowa and Ohio State that could potentially be in this place as well. That's certainly a close second here. Or it could be K-State and TCU, but I think that's a very distant third. That's in the case that K-State and TCU both really surprise and turn out to be really good football teams next season, which I don't really see happening. I mean, K-State could be good. I could see that happening, but TCU, not so much about them. But Texas and Oklahoma State, that's what I got for Week 8. Moving on to Week 9, we've got Ohio State and Penn State in State College. Big matchup in the Big 10 East. You got two teams that, I mean, of course, Ohio State is, once again, widely thought of to be one of the top teams to win the national title next season. And Penn State being at home, rivalry matchup, plus you got Penn State, them being at home in this matchup. I mean, potentially they cause an upset, a major upset. Should be a really good matchup in Week 9. You also got Michigan State and Michigan. That is also a very, definitely a possibility there. But Michigan, I do have, I mean, they just hosted Big Noon in Week 7 against Penn State, according to this. So I don't think that Big Noon would select Michigan against Michigan State in Ann Arbor again. I think they'd want to go to State College, to a different school for this one, which is also an outstanding matchup between Ohio State and Penn State here. You also got Oklahoma State and Kansas State. If both teams, potentially Kansas State, if they're a surprise team, that could be there as well. But in the end, I think it's going to be Ohio State and Penn State. Moving on to Week 10, we've got Baylor and Oklahoma in Norman. A pretty significant matchup in Week 10 for the Big 12. You got two teams who've got high expectations going into 2022. And, I mean, if both teams have got good or even great records heading into Week 10, there's a very good chance that Fox picks this one up, and it's in Norman for Week 10. This is one of the matchups, too, that last season. This was one of the matchups that took Oklahoma out of Big 12 contention and college football playoff contention for that matter. And it's what sent Baylor on their rise and on their road to a Big 12 title and to the New Year's Six. So pretty big matchup every year, and especially in 2021 it was, and I'd expect the same for 2022. Some other matchups, you got Minnesota and Nebraska and Iowa at Purdue. So you got two big matchups in the Big 10 West, but in the end, this matchup between Baylor and Oklahoma is going to beat both of those. Moving on to Week 11, we've got Nebraska and Michigan in Ann Arbor. So I've got Michigan hosting multiple games next season for Big Noon, which shouldn't be much of a surprise. Michigan, of course, is going to be a great team once again next season. I can almost guarantee it. I'd be very surprised if they weren't. They were a great team last season, and I expect the same for 2022 as they return a lot of their key players from last season. And this is a pretty big matchup. You got Nebraska, whose schedule really sets up for them to have a good record heading into November, if they do end up having a good season, for that matter. If Nebraska turns out to be a terrible team once again, like they were a couple of years ago, or even last year. I mean, the thing is about last year is they were 3-9, but they weren't even a bad football team. That was a team that could have gotten 8 or 9 wins last season. I mean, but they just, once again, it was just those brutal losses in the end. But if Nebraska turns out to be good, their schedule sets up right for them to have a good record heading into this matchup. You got Michigan, who should be in a pretty good spot as well. It totally makes sense if this was the matchup. You also got Wisconsin and Iowa, which could be a crucial matchup in the Big 10 West, potentially decides who wins the Big 10 West as well. That could be a big one as well. But I mean, ESPN's either going to take this game or the Wisconsin-Iowa game, and we'll see which one Fox gets. Could be Iowa State and Oklahoma State as well, but I've already got Big Noon Kickoff going to Oklahoma State just a couple of weeks prior, so I will say that they skip on that one, and they pick Ann Arbor instead. Moving on to Week 12, we've got Iowa and Minnesota, a Big 10 West matchup in Minneapolis. And this is also a matchup. I mean, that Big 10 West is extremely competitive. There are 5 teams that could almost equally win that division next season. Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Nebraska, and Purdue are those 5. And certainly both these teams are up there. And for all we know, this could determine the winner of the Big 10 West next season. You've also got Oklahoma State and Oklahoma Bedlam, just a huge matchup every year, and just a great matchup as well. One of the most memorable games of last season. And I do think ESPN ends up landing that game there, but is certainly in contention for this spot as well if Fox could land it. But I think in the end they land one or the other between Iowa and Minnesota and Wisconsin and Nebraska. And they pick the Minnesota-Iowa game instead. It's in Minneapolis, huge matchup. Totally would make sense for Week 12, especially if it could very well determine the winner of the Big Ten West. And now for Week 13, this week has already been confirmed, and that's going to be Michigan and Ohio State and Columbus. Just a massive matchup. It was a huge game last year, determined the winner of the Big Ten East. So it's basically, you could consider it to be a playoff game last year because, I mean, the winner of this very matchup last year went on to the Big Ten title game. They won a Big Ten title, and because they did that, they made it to the college football playoff. And I think it's going to be a similar situation once again this year. The winner of this matchup wins the Big Ten East, makes it to the Big Ten title game, and if they win that, they get to the college football playoff. Or even if they lose the Big Ten title, they still get in. We could see that happen as well. But yeah, just a massive matchup once again. It's always just a great matchup, great rivalry. I'd argue the best in all of college football, and yeah, just a huge one in Columbus this year. So, obviously Michigan winning it last year was a huge deal, but it is in Columbus this year. And Ohio State, I would say, is a much stronger favorite to win the Big Ten this season versus how they were going into last season. So, I mean, Ohio State is, I'd say once again, clear favorite to win the Big Ten for me, but I mean, they could definitely go on to win the national title as well. CJ Stroud, that team is stacked going into 2022. You've also got Michigan State and Penn State this week, Minnesota and Wisconsin as well, potentially your Big Ten West championship as well there with Minnesota and Wisconsin, but in the end, both those matchups don't compare, and plus it's already confirmed Michigan and Ohio State for Week 13. But anyway, that's going to wrap it up for today. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below on these predictions, and I appreciate you guys watching as always. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central. Catch you on the next one.